In this week's Parsha, good morning, PARSHAS SHELACH. At the end of the Parsha, we find the Parsha of TZITZIS, a mitzvah that we're makayim every day, all day. What's well known is that the mitzvah has two parts. These are the white strings and these are the tchelas. Now, even though there are those that wear tchelas, most people don't wear tchelas. It's not ma'akev. We could still be makayim the mitzvah even without tchelas. Like the Mishnah Menachah says, the tchelas is not ma'akev the lavam. That's more known that TZITZIS has two parts to the mitzvah, the lavan and the tchelas. But what's less known is another dimension of the mitzvah of what the Torah says in this week's parsha, Ure'isam oisai. Ure'isam oisai. The Even Ezra teaches, he translates, when the Torah says Ure'isam oisai, means you should wear the tzitzis in a way that it should be seen. Like the Shulchan Aruch says, the Lashon HaShulchan Aruch, Iker mitzvahs talus cotton. The ikar of the mitzvah is l'lavshay al begadav, to wear the beged, the tzitzis, on top of your shirt. And why? That it should be nearer to be able to see the tzitzis. The hainu re'isam oisa is wear the tzitzis in a way that it should be visible.
That's going on the beged or the strings?
The PARSHAS Lashon HaShulchan Aruch, you want to know, is it referring to the beged, is it referring to the strings? I'm not going to go a lot into the discussion, but from the mashmois of the Shulchan Aruch, it says the beged, that means the whole talus cotton should be on your shirt. From the Chassam Sofer, which I'm going to say right now, it seems more that the tzitzis should be hanging out. But regardless, whether if it's the beged or it's the tzitzis, ure'isam oisai means that you should be able to see the tzitzis. Not that if you want to see the tzitzis, you could take a peek and look at it. It should be out, available to be, you should be able to see it. The Chassam Sofer in Drasha says that being that we live between the goyim, there are, he says, roiv mitzvahs, a person cannot be makayim. And when he zooms in to speak about tzitzis, he says, because we live between the goyim, and we're afraid to wear the tzitzis out, and the strings, some say talking about the strings can't be hanging out. His lashon is, you're not yoytze yedei chayvasei. So what we have so far is how the Even Ezra translates, understands, Ure'isam oisei. We say it in Kriya Shema at least twice a day. Ure'isam oisei. The Even Ezra understands, wear the tzitzis in a way that you're able to see the tzitzis. However, on top of this, besides wearing the tzitzis in a way that it's visible, that you could see it, there are many Rishonim that learn that there's a mitzvah min ha-Torah to look at the tzitzis. There's a mitzvah ben ha-Torah to wear tzitzis. There's another mitzvah, an additional mitzvah in tzitzis to look at the tzitzis. Ure'isam oisai, when the Torah says Ure'isam oisai, the Torah is saying you should see, look at the tzitzis. Ure'isam oisai, we just said up until now to Even Ezra, wear it in a way that it could be seen. In addition, say the Rishonim, as we're going to see clearly, these are mitzvah ure'isam oisei, to look at the tzitzis. To look at the tzitzis. The Gemara Menachos, Daf Mem Daled Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, V'chol she'ein lo, I'm just taking out the words that are negayah to us. The Gemara says, a person doesn't wear tefillin, whoever, V'chol she'ein lo tzitzis bebigdoi. If you're not wearing tzitzis, you're wearing dalat kanfas without tzitzis, says the Gemara, oiver behei esen. If a person wears a beged dalat kanfas without tzitzis, he's over on 5 aseis. What are the 5 aseis? So Rashi explains. He just brings the word of each pasuk. I'll say where it is. Rashi says, V'asu v'nasnu. In this week's parasha, it says, V'asu lahem tzitzis. So if a person wears a beged without tzitzis, dalet kanfas without tzitzis, he's mavatul dasei of when the Torah Kedosha says v'asu lam tzitzis. The Torah says v'nosnu al tzitzis. That's number 2. V'hoyu lachem letzitzis. Number 3. Says Rashi, and what's number 4? Uri'isem oisai. Asay number 4, and asay uri'isem oisai. You should see the tzitzis. You should look at it. And then number 5, Gedilam Tasalacha. Al Kapanim, you see from Rashi clearly that he's a mitzvah and a Torah to look at the tzitzis. The Yesod V'Sherish Avodah brings this Rashi and he expands, and I'll just read one line of what he expands to say that it's a deraisa. He brings Rashi and he says, you see, he's a deraisa. But Al Kain, because I just showed from this Rashi that he's a deraisa, tzorech ha'adam lehistakel b'tzitzis, a person's supposed to look at his tzitzis, ulechavein, when you look at the tzitzis, ulechavein behistak lezu, when you look at the tzitzis, lakayim, mitzvahs asay shal re'isam oisai. When a person looks at a tzitzis, you should be mechavan, mitzvahs trichas kavana, you're being mekayim, a mitzvahs asay deraisa of looking at the tzitzis. Other Rishonim as well say it's a mitzvah min HaTorah. The Smak, Sefer Mitzvahs Cotton, it's a Sefer, a minyan HaMitzvahs. He lists out one of the mitzvahs, one of the Taryag mitzvahs is to look at the tzitzis. The Smag as well also counts it as a mitzvah. The Tashbitz. These Rishonim say that it's a mitzvah min HaTorah to look at the tzitzis. As well as also in the early Achreidim, the Sefer Charedim. The Sefer Charedim goes through all the mitzvahs. What part of your body do you use to makayim the mitzvah? We're learning Hilchas Kibbut Av Eim in the night Kollel. So it's very interesting. There's a lot about Kibbut Av. You can be makayim it, the machshava, the dibur, how you speak, the maisa. He goes through, he breaks up all the mitzvahs, different parts. Says the Charedim, there are mitzvahs that are toli be'inayim, that you look. Mitzvahs asay min HaTorah, the caption of that perik, min HaTorah atluyim be'inayim, with the person's eyes, and you can makayim it ve'ef shalakayim b'kol yoyim. A mitzvahs asay min HaTorah, with your eyes you can makayim every day. And he says, le'estakel b'tzitzis, because it says, re'isa moisai. Rabbi Chaim Vital in Sharei HaKedusha, when he lists out mitzvahs asay min HaTorah, he says to look at the tzitzis, mitzvahs asay min HaTorah. From all these Rishonim, it's clear that there's a separate mitzvahs asay min HaTorah to look at the tzitzis. The Sfas Emes in the Gemara Menachos, the Sfas Emes goes on the Gemara that the Gemara says, Ein lecha mitzvah kala like tzitzis. It's such an easy mitzvah. The Goyen, before he was nifter, the way they bring, he was either cried or was sad, not because he was being nifter, is because of the mitzvah. As he explained, he said that the mitzvah of tzitzis, it costs mamish a little bit, even if you get a mohodadig appear, and it's so easy to be makayim. The Gemara says, Ein lecha mitzvah kala like tzitzis. Frektis vasemes. What do you mean mitzvah? What do you mean mitzvah kala? First of all, shkula mitzvah tzitzis keneget kol atara kula. So it's a mitzvah kala. It's a very fundamental mitzvah keneget kol atara kula. Va'oid, the mitzvah of tzitzis includes tchelis. And tchelis is expensive. So what's mitzvah kala? So he says the Gemara is referring to the mitzvah of uri'isa moisei, looking at tzitzis. To get the tzitzis, to make the tzitzis, to buy it can be expensive. But looking at the mitzvah, looking at tzitzis, which is a mitzvah, ein lecha, that's a mitzvah kala. But the Sfas Emes says that it's an anaf mitzvah, meaning to say is up until now, how we understood clearly in the Rishonim, it's a separate mitzvah. Rashi says there are 5 mitzvahs by tzitzis. The Sfas Emes says it's anaf of the mitzvah. It's a part of the mitzvah to look at the mitzvah. It's a sniff. However, The Rivash argues. The Rivash says it's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah. V'haraya, the minyan ha-mitzvahs, the Rambam doesn't count it as a separate mitzvah, though we said before that some do count it. It's not a mitzvah. But he says, because the first and foremost reason for tzitzis is u're'isam oisei u'zechartam, as we're going to get to soon, be'emshech, it's a shmira, it's a skula, and that happens through looking at it. So Mamela says the Rivash, it's a maila, it's a minig yafa, it's an inyan, you should for sure look at the tzitzis. But to say it's a mitzvah, I say it's not a mitzvah, I say. But it's a big maila. And says the Rivash, v'chein ani noyeg, to look at the tzitzis. The tshuva begins, somebody asks, he says about looking at the tzitzis, he said that the shoyl says, I look at my tzitzis, and people make fun of me, and they say, what are you doing looking at the tzitzis? Who ever heard of such a thing? Because the Torah says, u're'isam oisoi, so that you're looking at the tzitzis, and then when the Torah says, u'kshartam la'ois, al yadecha by tefillin, are you going to tell me that you should touch your tefillin? And then in the middle of Kriya Shema you say, u'chsaftam al mezuzah beisecha, are you going to tell me in the middle of Kriya Shema that you should go to the door to kiss the mezuzah also? That's what the shoyl asked the Rivash. So the Rivash says like this: Re'isa boisei, yes, big mila to look at the tzitzis, 100%. Tefillin, yeah, we spoke about it over here in the Kollel a little while back. Chayim adel mashrish with tefillin b'chol shah, for sure. When you say ukshartam lois, definitely touch your tefillin. Are you asking me mezuzah? Okay, the mezuzah is not lefanenu. You're davening by the table. We don't say that you should go to the door to touch the mezuzah. But something that's lefanenu, yeah, definitely, yeah. And Mela the Rivash comes out clearly that there's a mila, definitely. We'll soon see when, but there's a clear mila, to look at the tzitzis. Not a mitzvah. The Ma'orei Nayim.
Is there any mila to standing up when we go to the door, or?
I never. You want to know if there's a mila b'chlal to go to the door to kiss the mezuzah? I never heard of such a thing. Could be even not, because you're in the middle of Kriya Shema. So if it's not brought, so then you're doing things in the middle of Kriya Shema. Though by tefillin taka you are doing it. Yeah, you're there lefanenu. That's what we taught the Rivash said.
Also, the same thing you're saying with tefillin could be true with tzitzis.
It is. No, but that's why just like tefillin, it's lefanenu.
So you're saying the fact that it's not lefanenu is the whole reason there's no Indian to stand up and walk to the door.
Correct. That's why very good. By mezuzah, there's no Indian to do it because it's not lefanenu. What?
If someone's the pacer, he can't sit still. He's walking back and forth and back by down. He's by the door already.
Well, what's if a person, his seat is by the door?
That too.
I don't know.
You can ask even further, like Vishinamtam Levanecha, are you going to
You sit down and learn. Of course you're not. It's a hefsek. But l'maisa mezuzah, to sit down Vishinamtam Levanecha, to sit down and learn in the middle of Kriya Shema, for sure not. But you want to talk, no, mezuzah, that would be interesting, taka. Mezuzah, if the ma'ayim were, I'm not aware. Could be there is such a thing, but it's not. It's definitely not what's done. That's clear. Before you do it, make sure there's a clear maramakim for that. But it's definitely not done. That's clear. On the note to say that there's a mila of looking at the tzitzis, call it a mila as opposed to a mitzvah. The Ma'orei Nayim has a kuntras called Hanhagas Yesharis. In Ois Tezayin, in middle of the Ois, Agav, he starts off, Hanhagas Toivis, good Hanhagas. So he starts off and he says, Li Zoher Ma'oid, Besimchas Pesach. Agav, to make sure to be happy Pesach. Sukkos, no one has such an issue to be happy. Pesach, make sure to be happy. Hanhaga Toiva. But then in the middle he says, V'lizoher lestakel b'tzitzis. Lizar, meaning to say is if it's a mitzvah min ha-Torah, it's not just a zehirus, it's a mitzvah min ha-Torah. So we have over here Rishonim that say that it's a mitzvah min ha-Torah. We saw in the Rivash says that it's a maila. The Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Chav Daled, the Shulchan Aruch, when speaking when to look at the tzitzis, we'll get to that momentarily, but the Shulchan Aruch says, when you look at the tzitzis in different times, the Shulchan Aruch says in Sif Gimel, Toiv l'stakel b'tzitzis, in Sif Daled, Yesh noyegim l'stakel b'tzitzis, in the different times we'll get to. Does the Shulchan Aruch mean that the whole looking at the tzitzis is a maila? Or is it, there's a chiyuv minat Torah to look at the tzitzis? However, what part of the day, when to look at the tzitzis, that's yesh l'stakel. And I want to tell you, it's very interesting. The Be'er HaGoyla, when he sources these dinim, he brings Rashi and he brings the Rivash. So I wouldn't say it's confusing, or not Rashi brings the Smak. The Smak says that it's a deraisa, the Rivash says it's not a deraisa. So you could clear in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says toiv l'stakel. Does it mean in general to look, or toiv l'stakel at this particular time, as we're going to get to during Kriya Shema? The Shulchan Aruch and Sif Ches also, as we mentioned earlier in the Shiur, when speaking about wearing the tzitzis out, the Shulchan Aruch says, Iker mitzvahs talis cotton, to wear it out, kedei shetamid yirei, you should always see it. So what is he saying? Is he saying that the Iker mitzvah is to wear it out so you'll be able to see it and have the mile of seeing it? Or the Iker mitzvah is to wear it out and to see it? So it's not clear if the Shulchan Aruch says that he's a chiyuv to look, or he's a mile to look at the tzitzis. Okay, so we have, it's definitely a mila. Some Rishonim say it's a mitzvah minat Torah, but it's definitely a very big mila. A mila, very big, as we'll see soon, is Tamar de Geshmira. How often to look at the tzitzis? So it's interesting, the Shara Kavanas, Chaim Vital, says, B'chol Shah, all the time. I don't know if all the time means if you're learning, so then you're learning, but if you're just not doing anything, look at the tzitzis. That piece over there in the Ma'aranai, when he says it's on Hagatov, he says also B'chol Shah. Lamaisa, all the time, there are times, specific times, that a person should look at the tzitzis, whether if it's to Makayim, the mitzvah minat Torah, or to be Makayim, to have the Hanhaga Toiva. Rabbeinu Yoinin Sefer Yira, the Rivash, in that tshuva that we said before, the Shulchan Aruch, when you say Uri Isam Oise by Kriya Shema, you should look at the tzitzis. That's a time to look at the tzitzis, whether if it's Makayim the Deraisa or to be Makayim the Maila. Another time to look at the tzitzis, brought in that Tshuva Rivash and brought in Shulchan Aruch, is when you put on the tzitzis. When you make the bracha, you should look at the tzitzis. Just to conclude, whether if it's a mitzvah sasei minat Torah or whether if it's a maila, the first thing is the Torah says, Uri'isam oisai, and by looking at it, Uzachartem es kol mitzvahs Hashem. Like Rashi brings, tzitzis is begematria 600, right? Though it's a question, there's no, how's tzitzis 600? Saf is 400, these two tzaddiks, that's 90 and 90, is one yud. You look in the pasuk, there's no two yuds, so it's really 590. So either the way how you pronounce it with the chirek and memela, it's like there's a yud, or there's another pshat Tosfos brings that because it's 3 times tzitzis, so memela that each one of them you have, it's 30, so you stick it in. But al kapanim, that 600, you have the 8 strings and the 5, not 613. It reminds a person that Taryag mitzvahs, Uri'isam oisai uzachartem, it's called mitzvahs Hashem. Uri'isam oisai, also Chazal say, when you look at the tzitzis, you see the tchelis doime liyam, yam l'rakia, rakia l'kisi hakavod. When a person looks at the tzitzis, it reminds a person of the kisi hakavod. It gives a person Yirei Shamayim. So Zicher, Mitzvah, Maila. The Dazakanim right here in this week's Parsha explaining what's the smichas. Right before the Parsha of TZITZIS is the Parsha of the Makoshesh. The Makoshesh Eitzim. What's the smichas to the Parsha of TZITZIS? So the Dazakanim brings Moshe Rabbeinu asked the Rabbi Shalom, he said, this is the mitzvah of tefillin, Laman tia Torahs Hashem beficha. Tefillin also reminds a person, Torahs Hashem beficha, to remind a person the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu told the Rabbi Shalom, if tefillin would be worn on Shabbos also, the Makoshesh never would have sinned. Because he would be wearing the tefillin would remind him. So the Eibishter said, don't worry. I'm going to give you a mitzvah that you also wear on Shabbos, that's a shmirah. But often that the mitzvah of tzitzis that we also have on Shabbos is a shmirah. Moshe Rabbeinu said that the Makoshesh would have not been chayta because if he would have been wearing tefillin, so the Eibush said tzitzis. But often that tzitzis is a shmirah. If you take a look in Tshuvas Dovid Beisham, the Chabina Rav, it seems maybe that the shmirah is actually making of the tzitzis. That's a discussion. It's a whole tshuva. On the note of shmirah, I'm just going to quote a few lashonis in Shara Kavanas. He says like this: Chaim Vital. Of course, we have the Gemara Menachos, of the one that was about to be chayte, and then the tzitzis banged into him. Shara Kavanas da ki adam tzorich listako b'tzitzis b'chol shah, like we mentioned all the time. B'chol shah v'rega. He says v'hu te'eles gedoylel in a shama. It's a te'eles. It's a te'elis, a person's a sham. If you look at the tzitzis, not to be chayte. The Chavetz Chaim in Shmiras Haloshen, at the end, he says that tzitzis is a shmira, first of all, on not pure machshavas. It's a shmira, looking at the tzitzis. And the Chavetz Chaim in Mishnah Berurah says, in Siman Chav Daled, he says that this mitzvah is matzel a person, not just what he says in the Shmiras Haloshen, from machshavas, from not pure machshavas, he says from all chait, matzel ad ben achait. And he says a moira de gezach, he says, even though there is no other mitzvah, shar mitzvahs doesn't have a skula, a shmira to be nitzel men achet. Tzitzis has the skula to be matzel a person from chet. Mele reisa moise, a person should look at the tzitzis. The Bnei Yissaschar at one point was a Rav in Munkach, and he wrote takonis. One of the takonis, this was in the year 1828. Just short of 100 years from now, almost 100 years ago. 200, yeah. Yeah, 200 years ago, good. Thank you. He writes different takonis, and one of the takonis is Legabe the mitzvah of tzitzis. He goes very stark, and he says how people are mezalzel, the mevazet at tzitzis, they tuck it inside. But then he says, because people don't have the tzitzis out to see the tzitzis, to have a re'isa moise, the shmira, ein min ha'tema asher nechsholim b'avoyneseinu harabim b'averos chamuris. Kiven she'ein roya mitzvah. Because they don't have the tzitzis to see the tzitzis, to have it a shmira, it's ein min ha'tema. Kiven she'ein roya, the tzitzis is l'maskeres, to watch a person that is machshava shouldn't wander off. And just to conclude, just like we said that the tzitzis is a shmira for a person not to be chayte, it's also a shmira. The Sefer Charedim says that the riyah is maybe l'dei zechira, to remember the mitzvahs Hashem, and the zechira is maybe l'dei asiyati makayim. In the Shara Kavana says, "V'gam yasik te'elis gedola." A person, besides that, it helps a person from not being chayta. A person will gain a lot from looking at the tzitzis. The Chavetz Chaim says, "Riyas atzitzis is te'elis, to be mizdaris, zrizis, to help a person engage in the mitzvahs Hashem." Going a little not in the order, the Baranaim says, when a person looks at the tzitzis, Yisker Tamid, Yiras Hashem, V'havosoi, V'dveikosoi. And to conclude, the haflah in Sefer Panim Yafis, the Chassam Sofer's Rabbi, he says in the mile of tzitzis, I'm taking out one line, Ki b'riyasam, when a person looks at the tzitzis, Nitares ha'adam, Liyos Einav, V'liboy, his eyes and his heart, LeMitzvah Hashem. By looking at the tzitzis, a person purifies his eyes, his heart, to be able to mekayim the mitzvahs Hashem. We should be zoicha. Have a wonderful Shabbos.